You're listening to the Anthology Towns That Were, an episodic narrative podcast. Follow us on YouTube, twitter.com/townsthatwere, soundcloud.com/townsthatwere, and the Anthology Towns That Were on facebook.com. We hope you enjoy.
On the dirt brim somewhere on a winding road that, in the dark of the night, James can't quite discern, Rayla's cruiser idles. He's driven these mountainous roads long ago when his father sat behind the wheel, in place of Deputy Rayla Marsh, carried off on one of Don Grayson's hunting escapades. Now, however, James has found himself lost beneath the moon and stars hanging loosely over Malediction, West Virginia. As the cruiser's engine cuts off, the headlights dim against the trunks of the trees lining the roadside, the car tilting awkwardly on the steep hill, feeling as if it could topple down in the vast forest below. Unbeknownst to James Grayson, that's a mistake Rayla doesn't intend on making again. She opens the driver's side door, hesitantly, James notices. As if pushing forcefully past her reluctance, she drags one leg from the car. "I have something to show you," she tells James, slamming the door shut behind her, executing any chance James had to question her. James's ankles bear his weight as he holds his balance down the hillside, the angle of which he finds insufferable. His boots slip on the twigs and stones that line the hill, a desperate attempt to topple him to the bottom some ways down. They pass by a large, warped trunk, unknown to James that, slightly over a year prior, had brought Rayla's overturning cruiser to a dead halt. The same tree that had nearly ended her life all too soon. The same trunk that brought her to Gloria Grayson, that had initiated her investigations into malediction, into the impossible visions that clouded her mind. Rayla shakes the memory from her mind, letting her hand brush across the coarse bark of the tree, grateful for the opportunity to once more walk these lands. She ignores James's question, continuing over the crackling brush. She understands his concern, his hesitation. Hers is twofold. It had taken all that she could muster to bring her back, to once more walk these trails leading to the cave she'd found by no more than accident, tucked quietly into the mountainous hillsides of Malediction. Even in the early morning light, the sun's view obstructed by the peaks of the hills above them, the forest is dark, damp, and dreary. Something draws Rayla forward, automating her steps as if she were always meant to return. Even with so many months behind her, she recalls each rock jutting from the mountainside, each misshaped tree standing out of place from the rest. James feels the purpose with which Rayla walks, nearly losing sight of her now and again as she weaves between the trunks of trees. He careens behind her, swatting branches from his face, thin splinters clawing at his arms, and when he looks up, she's nowhere to be seen. He calls her name, again louder now, with no answer. James lessens his focus on the branches that fight diligently to slow his movements, and he powers through the woods. He keeps his arm outstretched, his palm brushing against the uneven rocks lining his right side. Once more he calls for her, rounding a sharp rock twice his height, pointed like the bow of the ship docked in his aunt's boathouse. James Grayson stares into the bloated mouth of the cavern, the path losing itself in the darkness beneath the mountain. His vision blurs, as if the shadowed hull extends eternally before him, spiraling like the waters of an ocean, so deep that the light has lost all comfort in making its appearance. He calls fruitlessly once more for Rayla before stepping foot into the darkness of the stone hall. The path guides him in the darkness, shoving him relentlessly, blindly through the crooked corridor. His legs follow his commands, one foot before the other, again and again and again, though the claustrophobic walls decide his direction, and onward he moves. Despite all hopes, his eyes fail in their attempts to adjust to the darkness, until a thin ray of dust-filled light echoes through a small opening before him. His pace quickens, desperate to free himself from the constraints of the stone walls closing in around him, revealing an ovular cavern some ways within the mountain, a well-concealed tomb of malediction's forgotten history. A small opening extending through the mountainside allows the slightest rays of light from the outside world to penetrate, flowing into the cold and dreary cavern in its dusty hue. Before him, Rayla sits on her knees, the palms of her hands dirtied and lacerated from her frantic pawing at the ground before her. It was here, she repeats the words over and over, mumbling frantically to herself, to the cavern, to malediction itself. She feels James's arm rest over her shoulders as he kneels at her side. She winces as he grasps her forearms, pulling her bloodied hands away from the chaotic circles drawn from her searching on the ground before her. "It was right here," she whispers once more, eyes welled with tears in the turbulence of her disorientation and embarrassment. None of it was real, she tells herself. Much as she'd like to believe herself, she knows what she saw here in this cavern, knows what she felt. She remembers what it showed her, remembers the tightening of her lungs as she floated helplessly beneath the surface of Lake Ophelia. Rayla recalls the horrid eyes of that which dwelt beneath Dead Man's Cove. She knows what troubles have haunted her, haunted Malediction, West Virginia since James Grayson's return. What she saw was real, is real. "We have to go," she tells James. His wide-eyed nod of obvious agreeance is noted, but she knows he doesn't understand, so she explains herself. "We have to go to the Cove." Where their boots press in the wet mud, the ground quakes, splitting slightly, as if wanting nothing more than to open wide and swallow them whole. The base of the stone pedestal they carry hovers only inches from the ground, though they know the outcome would they let the relic scrape across the muddied ground. It's no longer their concern, the chills of malediction digging deeper than that of a brisk wind. It had taken the men weeks to detach the fragment from its adhered position beneath the hills of malediction, deep in the darkness. Even longer to haul the piece from its prison of stone, but he assured them it would be worth it in the end. "It will be worth it," he told them again and again and again. In the end, faith guides the lost and broken, leads them down a path kept far from view, but he will guide them, as he always has. When finally they emerged into fresh air, the light of the sun washing away the stale air that soaked into their clothes and skin, the relic was loaded and hauled away, and with no more than a nod, they were left watching the old man drive away in his rusted pickup. They knew better, but an end to their experience that Strange couldn't even begin to describe had finally come to pass. Enough time elapsed before they heard the gravelly voice of the old man that they nearly forgot of him entirely. His sour tone crackled through their phones sometime around 3 a.m. on a stormy night, as if he waited for the perfect weather to fit the tone of his aphotic prophecies. Nonetheless, His will would be their command, so long as the envelopes he slipped from the breast pocket of his peacoat kept finding themselves in their hands. There weren't many things they wouldn't do for the kind of cash he was putting up. And to haul around the useless pieces of his town's history? Sure, they found the man odd, uncomfortable to be around even. But they were the ones using him, they'd convinced themselves. 3 weeks after they stripped the cave in the hills of Malediction free of its historical structure, they found themselves employed once again by the old man. Again, they find themselves hauling the artifact, as the old man calls it, watching him flinch, hearing him curse under his breath each and every time they move the object in a manner ill-suited to his liking. Reverend Sherman Dyer lets his cigarette fall to the ground, squishes it firmly into the mud beneath his boot, its sizzle against the wetness permeating the silence of the morning. He fights the urges churning within, watching as the two men treat his future, his destiny, as if it were nothing more than a worn-out piece of furniture. They know nothing, he reminds himself. Nothing more than you've let them believe. Of course, he knows what they think of him, how they view him. In the dark tidings to come, their judgments mean nothing, nothing at all compared to the reckoning at hand. He'd fought for years to find the relic, years of defeat, of crippling disbelief, of drunken stupors in his dismal room above the church, letting the beating rains against his window act as his only reminder that he still lived, still needed to move forward. It called out to him, and it would be him who brought about the passing of Malediction. Lake Ophelia sloshes gently against the wooden dock of Gloria Grayson's boathouse. A calming sound as James removes the cover from the boat, though the tenseness in his shoulders reminds him of his trepidation in returning to the eerily still waters. The dark clouds rolling in from the west, now that's a sight he can agree with. A dark, foreboding feature looming over the town that has recalled him, invoked his return to the buried truths of the Grayson bloodline. Rayla, gently rubbing the cold from her arms, worries less of the darkness moving in from above than she does remembering the sight of what she saw below the murky waters at their feet. She hears those words, locked away, floating amidst the waters, lost in the small whirlpools forming as the waves break against the docks. They're all trapped in the end, she knows. This time, there will be no lesson learned from her defeat, should it come to that. Rayla snaps from her thoughts, hearing James call her name over the trembling waters. She assures him that she's fine, repeatedly. She defends herself more than she ought to, dragging herself onto the boat, as Virgil's engine kicks to life. The machine hums loudly atop the waves, slowly creeping from the shelter of the boathouse, and Rayla quivers, knowing that the revving engine stirs the beast, cloaked in shadow beneath the waters from its adjoining slumber. Locked away you've kept. A fog rolls over the waters of Lake Ophelia, the fatigued breaths of the hollowed giant. Lying dormant, darkness slept. A stale, ghastly stench permeates the air, a decay from what lies before them, beneath them, slowly gasping at the fresh airs of malediction, all in hopes that their captivity has come to a rest, that those who've fallen prey to their reticent commands for release have, after so many failed attempts, opened the cage that's held them alongside such great misery. Virgil's bow cuts through the gloom as James cautiously lays into the throttle, hardly able to see before them. The silhouette of Dead Man's Cove gradually appears through the fog, a cautionary sight. Turn back, it seems to plead, to beg James and Rayla. And though James doesn't slow the boat as they approach, there is no turning around, no second guesses. None, at least, that are spoken. Virgil's siding scrapes gently against the derelict dock, standing worn and mistreated, before coming to a stop, rocking gently amidst the waves. An eerie silence floats atop the fog, as if the dense gloom has soaked in the waves of sound from the cove like a winter's jacket stealing the cold air. James helps Rayla from the teetering boat and ties the craft half-heartedly against the dock, assuming that, with even the slightest storm, the dock will pull free from its final thread of life and float out to its resting place upon the waters. He pities the dock, in fact, sympathizing with its state of peace with what's to come. The foreboding obscurity lingering over malediction has seeped into every living soul, whether they're aware or not. It has absorbed all hope, leaving nothing but an overhanging bleakness. It has replaced the greens of the trees, the browns of the hills, the blue hues of the sky, bestowing only silent tones of gray. Rayla wanders ahead, enough that her form becomes nothing more than a beautiful figure bounded by fog. The winds of the air cut through her parka, ruffling the fur-lined hood against her back. Her pace quickens, only slightly, in anticipation that those words will reappear to her, that the deep voice floating beneath the depths will call to her, guide her. A deafening moan replaces her anticipation, a painful creaking that holds the morning captive. It is a tone that pulls the clouds rapidly across the sky, deepening the gray of the day, casting shadows upon the cove. Before her, a gray tree lies seething, its massive trunk warped and battered from a life longer than any would hope to live. Perhaps, at one time or another, it had contemplated the length of its own existence, that the centuries behind it were one too many. Now, Rayla wonders, as it lies motionless, waiting again on time itself to pull the tree, piece by piece, back into the dirt from which it sprouted, that it had more time to stand tall, overlooking the tainted waters of malediction. At her side, James climbs over the tree as if he hasn't noticed the pain caused by its downfall, though, unknown to her, the anguish of malediction's loss has utterly overruled James Grayson. It has engulfed him like a plague, moving every individual muscle within him. It has poached his emotions, releasing the chilled tears that roll down his reddened cheeks. It drowns out Rayla's call to him and moves him further through the cove. His boots sink gently into the hollowed ground where the massive tree once stood, and the enduring essence of the ancient keeper traverses his nerves, wraps tightly around his bones, fills him with an anger so deep, so powerful, that the world around him feels minuscule, irrelevant. He feels the hatred of his ancestors, the tales he heard of his forefathers, their madness, their condemnation. This is your end, and he truly believes it. In some sense, he wants it, needs it more than anything he's ever thought necessary. James Grayson finds himself on his knees, his hands clenched into the damp dirt before him. The soil, still full of life that has so recently collapsed around it, seeps between his nails. He feels so many years of anguish, feels his father and those before him. They were here, he knows now. He knows they felt the same suffering he feels now, searched for whatever pulls him in. His hands slide through the soil. His nails chip and bend. Rayla stands over his shoulder, afraid to interrupt his frantic motions. She watches as his hands move with a vicious rhythm, the form in the dirt beginning to take place. Crescent moons and spiraling galaxies, crashing waves over sinuous currents. A reminiscence floods over her before she sees what they are. The same markings that her blood so gracefully flowed through on that relic within the mountains over a year prior reveal themselves on the circle of dirt where the Guardian once stood. She feels the creaking of the fallen, the rumbling at her feet. She feels her foot step forward. Before she can call to James, beg him to stop, plead for him to come back to her, the etchings in the dirt extend of their own volition, filling the entirety of the circular void they stand within, surrounding them both. The soil, once damp, dries and cracks, splitting around her feet, around James, revealing an opening of blackness that swallows them both. Intruders. The voice comes clearly before their vision returns. Perhaps their vision was never truly gone, only concealed by the darkness of the cavern. Trespassers, locked away. A searing pain jolts through Rayla's shoulders as she raises herself from the ground. James, even against her volatile shaking, remains motionless upon the rocky bed, a thin layer of water lapping against his face. Yet again, her calls to him go unheard. Rayla steadies her breath, loosens her shoulders, giving her eyes time to adjust to the darkness. There's a quiet pattering upon the ground from the stalactites hanging overhead, nearly touching their counterparts that rise from below. Something stands before her, firm and complacent, another shadowed shape. Even in the dismal cave within Dead Man's Cove, she recognizes it. Recognizes the graceful form of the stone dais she'd found a year prior, in a different abyss within the custody of malediction. But the formation carved from stone doesn't stand unattended. A hoarse voice gives view to the figure standing behind the dais. It calls out quietly, allowing the acoustics of the cavern to do with his words as it will. "Your time is now," the voice calls, "for both of you." Rayla knows the words, their familiarity. She'd recognize the Reverend's hollow words anywhere. "Come," he continues, his shadowed arms extended like wings beyond the dais. "Come forth and claim what's yours." James twitches at Rayla's feet, his hand patting the water-covered stone, his legs shifting eagerly as he wakes. Go to him, she tells herself. Help him. But Rayla's feet pull her closer to the dais, caring little of her concern for her friend. First, she feels their presence, as if the walls of the cavern implode with the forces of the lake, its waters crashing down upon her from both sides. As her head whips to either side, she instead finds two figures passing by her and James as if they're non-existent. Their feet, in unison, pass by Rayla, and a luminescent blue light flickers from atop the dais, illuminating the dark features of Reverend Dyer's face. The men who walk past her are young, shirtless, their bodies ripped and torn from their apparent time within the cavern, their eyes leaking the static blackness that's haunted Rayla for so long. Reverend Dyer speaks to the men as if they're part of his congregation. Perhaps they are. Perhaps they're the initial flock of this desecrated invocation the Reverend mumbles over the relics standing before him. Rayla waits for the figures following their summons to notice her, to turn to her. She waits for their absent gaze to bore into her and bring her to her knees. Neither stops. Neither of the figures break their stride towards the dais within the hungering mouth, its teeth of solidified rocks, the blue glow from within, the deepening breath urging them closer. Rayla again shakes James, begging him to rise. Her eyes never break free from the gathering before her. That's enough, she scolds herself, returning to her feet, her stance widened. Deputy Rayla Marsh struggles to pull her handgun free from its tattered holster, aiming it awkwardly towards the cavern's mouth before her, the flickering lights troubling her vision. She squeezes, once, twice. Warning shots is all, hoping to pull the helpless men from their stupor, to intimidate the Reverend from his position of control. The silent clicks from her weapon return a blatant disregard for her authority, and she tosses her gun aside, splashing and tumbling against the cavern's floor. Rayla scoops James, his head under one arm, lifting him to his feet. She feels his legs pumping, holding him with whatever strength remains, though his head dangles, a slur of muffled mumbles falling from his lips. She comforts him with words of their safety, of the land above, the confinements of the Grayson estate. But as she turns, the utter darkness of the cave defeats any hope she holds. She's thankful James can't understand. At first, the grumbles of the cavern were nothing more than minor aches and pains from the water's pressure attempting its collapse from the outside, the wakening of what lies beneath. As Rayla drags James blindly through the slick corridors, the walls shake with a fervor that topples them to the ground once more. Each time, she lifts James, feeling more and more of her strength dissipated with each collapse. At their back, the blue light before the Reverend expands, as if it lurks behind in their wake, awaiting its opportune time to strike. In a sense, it guides their way, like a wolf guarding the rear of its injured pack. "Come on, James," Rayla grumbles. "Get it together." Rayla knows the words are meant for her. She's known all along, in fact. Their fall hadn't been so great as to cause the state of whatever James has found himself within. Rather, something within these claustrophobic corridors has grasped his mind, trapping himself within. Loose stones collapse around her as she hauls James forward with a strength unknown to her, ambitious to breathe the airs of malediction, whether they belong to her or not. The holes that form in the walls around her fire jets of water like cannons, colliding painfully with her skin. Alongside the blue light stalking from behind, barely illuminating the darkness that surrounds them, the Reverend's voice carries through the halls, bouncing powerfully against each misshaped crevice within the stone corridor, growing with a strength all but possible, as if it alone were bringing down the very foundations of the caverns beneath Dead Man's Cove. As it had when James unconsciously etched the runes upon the muddied grounds above, the rocks beneath Rayla's boots crack open effortlessly, revealing the darkened depths, radiating the faintest red, the light calling to her. Locked away. Its hushed tone pleads to her, tells her of her fate. Beneath the depths, you're bound to stay. Forget all that you know, Rayla tells herself. Forget all that you believe and press forward. It's all that she can do, one foot before the other, each step enhancing the searing pain through her entirety. She doesn't fall into the darkness beneath her feet. Instead, watching as they step gracefully atop the murky waters, moving further into the darkness before her. But each step angers the calm waters, rippling their slumbering surface. And the ripples grow as she moves forward, crashing into one another until they evolve into waves, white-crested and boiling. They reach for her, fingertips of black waters, until her knees are submerged, until she watches as the dark water crawls into James's mumbling mouth, watches him choke and gag, until her eyes feel the stinging of the cool, lapping waves. The water muffles the mumblings of the Reverend, but a sense of pride lingers on his tone, as if he'd commanded the water itself to steal into the caverns and drag the interlopers down into the depths. Rayla stares up at the sunken half of Dead Man's Cove, trembling beneath the surface of Lake Ophelia. It's there that she watches the blue light that emanated from the dais, trapped within, encompass the island, and the black waters constrict her closer to James, tightening until their last breaths are stolen. Her cough spew tainted waters onto the shores of malediction, each frantic inhale pulling the sands of the bank into her lungs as Rayla lifts herself to her hands and knees. Her fingers grasp at the solid ground, feeling the loose rocks between each one, the leather of the boots before her. She clutches James's leg, his jeans soaked through and through, tugs at him as she lifts herself higher, falling back cross-legged onto the beach. James Grayson stares down at her, the black water pouring from the smirk formed across his face as if his lungs are entirely filled with the waters that spit them out. His fingers wriggle, clenching with the anxiousness of the prey kneeling before him. And when she meets his eyes, for the first time, the bleeding blackness feels calming, a beginning of the end. He was her only chance, but she knows she was never truly prepared for it, not for any of this. The unyielding voice that echoes against the waters behind her is not of her friend, a voice of something higher assuring James, or whatever has taken a hold of him, that it's all over now, that, just like those that came before, he would fall on this beach. "You set out on these waters at Grayson," Sheriff Taylor says, his words not directed at James, nor at what's awakened within. The sheriff knows better. He knows that James no longer remains. "Just like your father," the sheriff continues in memoriam, "and his fathers down the line. You stepped foot back onto these lands something else. Something you tried so desperately to fight off. And just like your daddy, I'll have to put you down too." The static-filled eyes of James Grayson avert their focus to the sheriff, to the unholstered gun aimed feebly in his direction. "Just wish you'd stayed gone," the sheriff says, and the outcry from his weapon silences the grieving moans of Lake Ophelia.
The anthology, Towns That Were, is written by Michael and Jackie Gormley, narrated by Michael Gormley. Music and sound from David Hyde, Free to Use Sounds, The Dark Piano, Purple Planet Music, and Our Music Box.